Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of LOTUSWEI, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. I wonder, before we get into it, if you wanted to just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. First of all, it's an honor to be here with you too. Thank you for inviting me on. And just briefly, I think a lot of what will be kind of shown and shared will just come through our conversation and through the quality of our words and our gestures. But if I was to share a little bit, right now, currently, I work with men primarily. So I lead men's immersions out in the elements. And that's my love, really, because that's something that I personally do a lot of, is learning how to take the structures that are in us and the beautiful structures, and then meeting the more elemental aspects of life where there's not many straight lines and like the kind of structures that we would normally function on out in the elements. So I love bringing groups of men together and bringing them out into those kinds of environments where we can train really core virtues, core capacities of awareness, presence, integrity in that environment, and then build a bridge back into the environments of our life, our relationships, our work. So that's kind of an overview of what I do. And I come from, I've worked a lot with intimacy with couples too. And more recently, I worked a lot with qigong, which has been a really beautiful practice and lineage and a potency that has brought a lot into my life. I've come from more of a yogic background, but the last 2 years, I've been exploring deeply the qigong realms. So I think that's a good starter. And I could speak a little bit more about some of my influences and things like that if you like, but let me know.
Highly recommend the listeners to go check out the website, Eli Buren. I'm going to spell it for you. It's ELIBUREN. The videos. Oh my God, the videos page. I was like, I want to be there now. You have retreats in Zion, Bali, Denmark. You've done one in Sweden. And the video is just like, like when you're climbing up and under the waterfalls in Bali, is it?
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's like, how could anyone not want to do that? It just looks phenomenal. It kind of reminds me just like a little bit of the retreats that we do in Costa Rica for women. I was just thinking before we jumped on, I thought, how cool would that be if we led a retreat together someday? Mm-hmm. That would be amazing.
I would love to talk about that. Yeah. And the similarities between the kind and then the vast differences. So we would spend some time together and then it'd be like, okay, we're going to go climb that mountain. We'll see you back here. And some of the women would want to come and some of the men would want to probably stay. And then we'd navigate that.
So what are some of the practices that you bring into your men's retreats that you find to be the most impactful or transformative for the men who are attending?
Mm-hmm. Then I would say that the number one practice that has impacted me and I feel like is transmitted through really anything that I offer, whether it's a men's immersion or a tea ceremony, is the capacity of presence, like learning the practice of being really present in this moment. And I know it's easy to say, there's so many books about be here now and presence, and really all lineages talk about that in some way or another. But the felt, tangible experience of taking all the distractions that are calling us in different directions and coming home to the anchor of our body that's living right here, right now, that the breath is animating, that the air is touching the skin on, and feeling also the presence of like, okay, I'm speaking with you. And then there's a conversation to this soul across, in this case, a Zoom, but it feels like you're in the same room with me. But even if we were in the same room, that warrants and demands presence, to be standing or sitting in front of another being and sharing that moment together. It really is it's a sacred moment. So I think that that's one of the essential practices that we practice, is learning how to stay present with what one chooses. And that's a core masculine trait too. And because the capacity to stay focused and go towards and stay present with, with a career, with a wife as she goes through the different emotional, or with oneself, even with one's own emotional system as we go through our own emotional fluctuations. So I think presence is key. And then embodiment also, because one can be very present, but if there's not a physical body that's here and available and adaptable to the situation, it's nice to have a present body, but if I'm just sitting and there's no energy in my body, it's really only part of the equation. So those are the two main things I would say. And actually, I could keep going, but I'll add in one more, and that's really where it begins is depth too. So presence, embodiment, depth, because depth is what, it's what allows us to really sink into this moment and to sink past the surface of distractions and names and ideas and concepts, and really sink into a more mysterious quality of depth. And I think that's a very important value too.
I think that could sound really exciting to some people, and that could also sound really scary to some people. And so what do you say to the people that it feels like, oh, that feels scary? Or do you ever see in your retreats that, maybe in the beginning, some men are like, ooh, that's a little too deep. I'm not ready to go there.
Absolutely. I think we all have that experience in moments. And
right.
and that is what defines a practitioner. And the way I speak about it is someone that would be initially feel a sense of aversion or fear towards something, towards a person, an experience, an emotion, a physical place. And that can define one. We could be defined by those fears and say, okay, I'm not gonna, that's too scary and or that's too much. And that's one life direction. And then a kind of practitioner would say, ooh, that sounds intense. Like, I don't know what he means by that. And yet I'm curious enough to turn towards it and begin that process of facing the fear or facing whatever that thing is that we're slightly afraid. And there are things to not turn towards, of course, but if we have identified it's something that we do want to grow into or we want to stay in relationship to, that's a practitioner, is that you turn towards the thing, soften the face, soften the heart, soften the belly, and you create relationship, you create intimacy with whatever the thing is that's the most scary in our life. And that's a deep dive right in. So if someone was initially feeling like, well, that's too much, I would invite them to really just explore that sensation in their own body and to take a couple of breaths into it and to try to trace the roots back into their own sense of why is it scary or why does that sound like too much? And that's where the conversation starts.
When people talk about public speaking, sometimes people will say, well, maybe you can reframe when you think you're nervous, you can reframe it to like, actually, I'm excited. And I get the sense when you're talking to of when there's that like little bit of scariness, if we can actually sit with it, it's almost like, like in my Buddhist training, we talk about the other side of the coin. So like if you have a tremendous amount of rage and anger, the energy that lies on the other side of that coin is the same with fear. It's like if you can be with it, like you say, soften to it enough, you liberate a tremendous amount of energy that you can now use. Whereas if you just kind of tamp it down, it's almost like closing off an energy source. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. That's really what I think as a human being and as someone that is in this moment and present, if we want to be fully here, then being available to both sides and being in relationship to both sides is that we have more freedom. We have more availability to love in the way we want to love. Because if we're afraid of the one side of the coin or we're afraid of our shadow, we're limited in that. And there's actually one of the Qigong forms that we practice, it's you reach behind and literally you bring shadow unconsciousness forward and into a gift, and you bring it into consciousness, into you're offering. And that's partially why I said depth, is because that depth is what allows us to praise the beauty of life, of our wife, of a flower, is because it's coming from having been willing to look at our shadows or the things we're afraid of. And then that creates more depth in the way that we would praise what's in front of us. And if we're not able to do that, which there are times and real situations with trauma and injuries that everyone has their own timing to turn towards those things. So you can't force that process, but eventually the more we're able to, it makes us a more of a spectrumed human being. And that's what I'm interested in.
Wow. And do you feel when you're doing that Qigong practice, do you direct it towards like something specific in your life, or is it more just training yourself to be open to whatever is in the shadow?
Both. There's moments where, if I'm very personal about it, which I will be here some, is that there are moments where I feel parts of my being that are very heavy and have taken, 40 plus years to start to come to the surface, and to have an actual structure and a practice that allows me to bring it through the heart, bring it and offer it and let it go, or create a relationship with it rather than pack it down or turn away from it. It is definitely part of my practice. And so sometimes it is personal. Other times it's more worldly, where I'm feeling the tremendous anxiety and the fear of the world. And so I'll be practicing that, and I'll be just feeling my neighbors and just all the things that are going on in the world. So I kind of do both personally and more globally.
Wow. I know that when we talked on the Zoom before, I was saying that in my experience, only about 99% of folks who are taking flower essences in our community are women. Maybe, 1% or less are men. And I remember being curious about that one day, and I reached out to all the men folk in my life and said, like, what do you do when you're stressed? Or what do men typically do? And I remember just being totally tickled. Like, men and women are different. There are differences. And that's one huge one. I remember so many of the guys saying, like, well, drink, alcohol, sex, sports. That was kind of it.
TV, entertainment probably is a big one for a lot of people. Technology.
So then I thought, wow, like women are more sort of preventative self-care. They'll take flower elixirs because it's like, and maybe we just haven't done a good job of learning how to tell a new story for men. Like, it's a journey, it's an inner journey. You'll discover your own inner landscape, and maybe we'll get there someday. But what's your take on how men, are equipped for the intensities of life, and how we can either do a better job of sharing with our sons, or our partners in a way that allows men to have more of a range of, dealing with stress?
I appreciate that question, and the kind of the place it's coming from, of wanting to really support and see the differences in one another's rather than like make each other wrong in some way. But it's realizing that, we all learn differently, and different nervous systems need different kinds of medicine to open and relax. And so I would turn it back, first of all, to look at what the initial impulse of, let's say, if we're talking about men, of wanting, so they're feeling stressed, or they're feeling unbalanced in their life. They're feeling overwhelmed by responsibility of work, family, finances, their own health. Now, even the bigger the world and just the unknownness of what's going on. So there's all these overwhelming responsibilities, and they feel like essentially they want to be reminded of that they are aware and they're conscious, and they are consciousness. There's a part of a man that is undying, that is just present with all of these challenges, and that those challenges actually can bring us into more alignment, or they can crush us and make us smaller. And so it's a challenge, really, to show up. And so those same things you mentioned can be used as a way to numb out and escape, with entertainment or sex or alcohol or exercise, sports. But they can be the same things can be used to yogically open. And so sports can be a beautiful thing, or exercise in general that opens the physical body, or sex can be something when it's done in the right way, it's brings one deep into union, and it's an amazing, celebration of life rather than a escape from oneself. So it's the same thing, but it's just the way that someone comes at it is what is important. And so I think it's important for the women listening to this podcast too. I think it's a lot of the percentage will be women listening is to know that for many men, the physicality is the first way in. So often when I work with a group of men or with a client, sure, we could sit down and talk and we could have an understanding. But the moment we actually do something physical, whether it's a tussle or whether it's qigong or whether it's hiking up something intense, we come out of the mind and into the physicality, the heart, the body, and then there's way more of any man accessible in that moment. So that's good for the ladies to know too, is after some kind of a physical engagement, or even just a hug, even just an embrace, like to touch a man's body and he goes, oh, I have a body? He's been in his head all day on his computer or whatever. And so just the invitation into the body is a really good first step to help a man into turning towards the right direction. And then I think come bring it back if there's something else around that. But then around the flower essences, why I was specifically going there is because then there could be more room for subtlety. But often the masculine body mind doesn't start with subtlety. It starts with physicality and starts with more gross level, like movement. And that's when I work with groups, we almost always have to go through that layer. And then we get to subtlety. We get to being able to sit and where I think flower essences could be really exceptional. And, you and I have spoken about exploring that some, but it would be hard for most men to be that subtle, to take something and to actually feel it right away if they hadn't done some of the work beforehand. Whereas many feminine bodies, you're already tuned in that way, or in the sensual and the subtle realms where it's closer in.
I only laughed before when you said about, oh, I have a body, because I think that's something probably all of us can relate to, right? We're on our computers so often. But then I thought, as you were speaking, I thought it's really also like Western men, because if I ask folks in the East, they might say meditation, Tai Chi, Qigong. That's how I process heavy emotions. Or I have a woman make me dinner and I eat food and it's love, right? But it just seems like maybe here in the West or in the United States specifically, there isn't as much of a training, let's say, in martial arts or meditation or those types of skills that bridge so well that physical element you're talking about, the embodiment with the spacious quality of the mind.
Yeah, it is. It's very true. I mean, we are here. And if you have the, parts of the East, it's very much the spirit and the body included. And then parts of more like Africa and places where it's very physical, all about dance. And it's so embodied and so beautifully embodied. And I notice, and then many people have spoken about this, is that the West is actually an avoidance of the body. So for the most part, there's a fear and avoidance of the physical body because there's pain there and there's suffering, and finally it ends. And so there is a real choice to, I think, for male or female in any part of the world, to realize that our physicality is, this body is one body. And then we have our emotional body, and then our mental body, and then spiritual body. And there's other bodies, but those four bodies are spoken about in any tradition. And so you'll find that in different places will prioritize one body over the other. More the mental body is the important one, and someone's really strong in their mind. And so it seems like healthy that we would want to train all four bodies. And some people will be naturally more physical, but at least they have a sense of the emotional body, and they know how to be flexible and build muscle in those realms also, if that makes sense. So I just consider that healthy, really, where someone would choose, and it goes back to our prior conversation, is to choose towards something that's uncomfortable or scary. So if someone's afraid of their body because it's like, I don't know what's happening down here, or it's this area that there's so many emotions or pains that are scary, and I have haven't really addressed them for the last 30 years of my life. And so it's a real work for many beings to go into their body and feel the past emotions, the present fear of what's going on. But the mindset or the choice to live in a way that goes, okay, this is part of me. Let me turn towards it and include that in the way I move through my day. And that's, most traditions talk about that.
Love it. And what's the role that you see nature playing in like enhancing our capacity to open and turn toward ourselves?
I like that connection. I think that we share a real connection to the elements too. Well, I think essentially, first and foremost, we are elemental beings. So that is a beautiful, overlooked fact that we forget when we're in the screen time and we're in that realm, is that this physical body is completely dependent on air, water, earth, light to be here now, even talking. Like if I stop breathing. So we're inherently tied into this web of dependency to all things. Like, the fruit comes off the tree and it's plugged in, and then but we're still plugged in. We're like a piece of fruit or a flower that's still literally being sourced and nourished by all of those elements and by nature. And so we're part of that system or that web. And so even just the littlest recognition of that, if someone's living in a city and they've got a flower in their apartment, or they look out the window and they see a green tree, or they step outside and feel the sun on their face, that is an entrance back into our relationship to the elements. And nature, when one kind of engages it as a way of being present and finding depth and being aware with one's life, it invites us in. I mean, it's also beautiful to just go sporting, someone that just wants to go out and, go sporting on a lake or go running. And so I think those are, get outside, whatever it takes to get outside. But the more that we slow down and actually realize the environment we're moving through and how we come from that, and it keeps us real. It keeps us sane. I've often thought that, if someone was struggling with depression or, sanity even, and there are real cases where it takes something different, but take them out into nature and into a place where like you don't have food and you have to find water, and you straighten up pretty fast. It's like survival, and this is ancient. Living in this body knows how to survive. And so I think that there's a real reality of getting out into the elements and just reminding us of the source that we come from.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about your videos and soaking under those waterfalls, like how can you not feel beautiful yourself when you've had that beautiful experience? Yeah. It's like nature is such a reflection of that depth and mystery that you're talking about.
Yeah. And I want to add something to that, Katie, is that it's also, it's a healing. It's in a way, it's a honoring and a healing between yin and yang and masculine and feminine for all beings, for men and women, to have more of a relationship to these elements. It gives us more of a relationship to our own physical body, or for a man to then be able to look at his wife in the way of, wow, she is also a waterfall. I mean, we're all waterfalls of, and so that recognition for a group of men to be out in those environments, and that's the way I lead it. I don't lead it in the sense of like, climb that mountain and succeed and win. And, that's not my style. I'm much more of a, like, let's go hard and intense. Like there are moments where we really challenge each other and bring out that core, like masculine edge. But right there is the reverence and the sense of like, and feel this environment and respect it and honor it the way we move through it. And so that becomes a kind of imprint in people's body. Like you said, how can you forget that waterfall? And how can you forget that landscape in Zion where the air it was there touching you all the time? And then you come back home to a city, and that practice of just, even now as I'm talking, we can all feel this. You can feel the air on your skin. It's always there, like on your face, on your breath, but the air is always touching us. And it's the same air. It's touching both of us. It's touching all things. It's touching the trees. And that kind of a thread of presence helps us to stay reverent and awake to this possibility of being here. And it doesn't mean someone has to walk around nature-y, just hugging trees, and fun sometimes too. I love to hug trees, but it's also fun to be really strong and intense and go where you have to go. But to keep that recognition with us is what it heals the relationship in a way, because many men have cut off from that and they're just sharp and there's no sensitivity, there's no vulnerability there.
What would you say is a good practice or method or openness, awareness to helping us all be more vulnerable?
Two things come into my awareness. The first one is to really just take a look around. Like it's, just pay attention. Like we are pretty vulnerable. If you just notice what people are going through, and people are being born and passing out of existence, and like relationships are happening and falling apart. And so there's a lot of vulnerability if we just notice it and we're able to sit with it, and it's not a problem. We're not afraid of it. We actually realize that vulnerability allows us to be more present and more awake. And then the other piece is, this is more of, and we work with this with men, is to go toward sharpness. And so a lot of, if I just speak about men here, and a lot of what I'm saying here could be used, we're not speaking specifically about the masculine feminine dynamics. We're kind of talking a little wider, but anything I said we all have masculine and feminine in us. And so, but if I'm working specifically with a group of men, we will often train the sharpness. And so going in really close into becoming more and more precise, sharp, clear. And that allows, if someone really goes into that, then you can feel the vulnerability on the other side, which is a strange teaching, because many men have been taught that if you're too sharp, it's bad. Or if you're, you could hurt someone with the strength that you have, or, basically to negate our inherent desire for becoming a warrior and being sharp and protecting, because we don't want to hurt someone, or we don't want to be too masculine. And there's reasons for that, why that's wise. But the truer way to find that is to go towards those innate capacities. And then when someone becomes a master of sharpness in martial arts, for example, then there is an inherent softness and vulnerability that's there, because they don't have to prove anything anymore. They're not faking their sharpness. They're not afraid of their vulnerability and trying to become muscly because they're afraid of their vulnerability. They go towards that, and then they realize that the vulnerability or the softness or the beauty of life is the other part of the coin. It's the other side of it. And the more that you go towards it, the more it opens up. So I think that's a really beautiful way to look at it.
Wow. And the more able you are to be vulnerable, the more able you are to be fierce in a clear way. So like for people who are working on being more sharp and fierce and less nebulous and nice, what would you say to that?
Yeah, and going the other direction. And I think with all of these things, we have to be cautious of when it's a circular thing and someone is sort of lost in sharpness or lost in vulnerability, where that's just the only note they know how to play on the keyboard, like over and over again. And we would want to explore the notes on the keyboard and to really to feel the vulnerability of our existence. Then if you really feel that, you would, I think, want to step up and protect something, or to take a stand for something you love, because the vulnerability of that flower, it needs some protection. And if we just, and that's where we separate into two, where like the parts that within ourself, we have the masculine kind of more, or the yang guard, or the shield, and the yin sort of essence of whatever it is, and the vulnerability, even within our own self, but within a relationship or a culture. The more that we notice these essences, then naturally someone would feel the vulnerability, and someone else would want to protect that vulnerability.
Wow, I love that. Totally makes sense. And what do you see are some of the major sticky points in men-women relationships? And how can, if the majority of people listening are women, how can women be more supportive to men?
The first thing that happens that's just blocks intimacy and blocks real relationship is when we blame and we want someone to be like us, and we talk to each other like you're talking to your girlfriend, or like a man's like he's talking to his male friend. And so it's not honoring the differences in the way our bodies receive and what we need. Do we need more space? Do we need to be more light, more container? And so that recognizing that we're two very different beings, and training and sensitivity to notice how your words and the way that one's holding their posture, the way that someone's breathing or not, the quality within the eyes, that those are all inviting relationship. And that's a personal responsibility. That's not something I can say, you should do more, And so whenever we get into that place, which all intimacies do, I mean, that's why we're there, is they're inherently disturbing on some level, when in a real intimacy, we're forced to a place where we are disturbed. And that's where we get a chance to either revert to a kind of adolescent blame, or to practice maturity and realize, okay, I can open and practice what I am here to practice right now, which may be love. Maybe so you open the body as love, or it may be kind of freedom and space. So you open the body as freedom, or as kind of consciousness, we could call it. And so it's turning these things around and realizing that it's essentially one's practice all the time, whether anyone else is there. And that's a yogic practice and I keep saying this, but the capacity to open the eyes, open the throat, the heart, the belly, the womb, or the lower body in a man, and just keeping that part relatively available to life and to a husband or to any situation. That's the practice we have the rest of our life. And we get to realize where we crunch down into, contraction and blame and hurt. And that may be true for a moment, but eventually one's got to go, okay, this hurts, or you hurt me. You said something that bothered me. I can still soften my throat and breathe again, feel the air on my skin, feel that my heart is essentially light. Let that start shining through and out again. And so that's one of the essential practices around intimacy, I think, in relationship. And I think there's another question in there that I forgot.
If we celebrate the differences, how can women inherently be more supportive of those differences and more sensitive to, what do men need? And I realized I'm just one woman and you're one man, but it's not like I could speak for all women and you could speak for all men. I realized that, but there are differences. So in celebrating those, like tell me about those from your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. And it is unique to a person. I think that's where I was going also, around the sense of training sensitivity, so that one would know how I affect. So if I'm a woman and I'm wanting to invite my husband into more availability, more intimacy, or I just see that he's struggling. He's walking around with tight shoulders and tense eyes. And I know he's deeper than that. I know that he has more in him, yet he's being defined by something that I don't really know how to help him out of. And so I think a lot of people can relate with that. The first thing is to notice where I want him to change because it makes me contract, and where I need him to be different so that I can and that's true in intimacy. But if it's coming from my need, then it's not going to be received as much. That's going to be a harder communication. If he's feeling your tension and you're saying, honey, can you turn towards me and give me some attention? But it's coming from a place of tension. It's just not going to work so well. So that initially, that's why I was saying that we turn towards our own practice, and then noticing you still might be hurt by his contraction and by his lack of freedom in that moment. You might still feel like a contraction, but then there's a part of you that goes, okay, I love this man. How can I help him remember what he is? And so there's lots of different practices here. I'll throw out a couple, but one of them is to already feel what you trust in him, even if he's not showing it to you. And this is for committed relationships more. So it's like you can feel like, well, the kind of man that you know is his core, and just put your attention more on that than the superficial stuff that he might be showing you. So occasionally you can do that. You can invite him into his body through your invitation. And if we go into real more like masculine feminine polarity practice, this is very specific to a woman and a man that are together, and you say, well, this woman wants to help her husband come back into intimacy and come back into relationship. The more of an invitation it is, rather than a blame or a demand, that's usually the way to at least initially get him to turn. And that invitation usually will come in the form of less words, because if you're talking words, you're going to get him in his head again, which he's already residing there. And that's why it's not working, because he's in his head more. And so less words and more expression, more dance, more energy through your body moving, whether it's sound, whether it's touch, whether it's you just enjoying life yourself, like even just, a man's in his trip, he's trying to get somewhere on time and he's uptight. And I mean, and so just like for someone to then see a beautiful flower as you're walking somewhere and just like throw yourself to the ground and just exaggeratedly show the pleasure of that flower, or a glass of wine, or a bite of food, and just exaggeratedly show, oh, God, it's so delicious and pleasurable in this body. That's a kind of invitation. That's going to invite him out of his head and into the moment with you. And then you're on a different playing field. You're not just talking head to head. You're having a more of an embodied conversation. So that's another way, is inviting him. And then you can also, it's really good for men just to be around men too. So some of the stuff you can't do for him. You could help him. You could put a book near him. You could say certain things. And there's times to have a real conversation. Say, sit down and say, listen, we're going to have a head-to-head conversation. This is not working for me, or it hurts me when this happens. That's very important. But it can't always be that. Sometimes it's got to be a little more dynamic. And so somehow helping him get into a circle of men, or even just spending time with his best friend, is a really important thing. I often have in the groups, usually a man or two show up because of their wife, sort of, or like either it gets to the point where like you have to go to this, or it's like literally our relationship's on the rocks and go find yourself, go figure something out. And so quite often men come and they're a bit kicking and moaning at first, like, I don't really want to be here. But within the first hour, first 5 minutes, it immediately changes, and they feel the value for themselves to be around other men, and they immediately take it on and go, this is for me. Actually, I want this for me, which has got to be, because if he's doing it just for you, meaning his wife, because he thinks you want it, but he's not really signed on, it's going to be half-assed. It's not really going to work.
What do men get from being around other men?
There's definitely an accountability piece, in a way that we can't do that between a husband and a wife. Between two men, there's a sense of inspiration of how another man's living, and then accountability with our own experience of, I want to become the man I'm meant to be. I want to be that man. I don't want to be lost in distractions. And so by either seeing that in another man, or by having conversations where we can find real vulnerability, and you see other men are struggling too. So that's another thing men get, is being able to realize that you're not alone, and everyone's going through different stories of challenges. And so when we go around a circle and different men are sharing, there's just it's a realness. There's a camaraderie in that acceptance, and yet not collapsing into it, but sitting there talking about life with a strong spine and an open body, and realizing that, okay, this is what I'm here for, is to learn how to stay open in the midst of her storm or the life storm. And then they also get a chance to play and find a sense of, like, it's hard to put into words, Katie, but there's very much the spectrum of play that goes into depth that is hard to find. So many men, they play when they're kids, they play sports, they wrestle, And then some men continue that into more professional sports or teams. But most men don't. Most men stop wrestling, stop being wrestling around, or it goes into a realm where it's very competitive and it's more like guys thing where they're just playing and then they're getting drunk afterwards. It's very few places where men can go and play hard and then the next moment meditate deeply, or like try to slap each other and like have like this roughhouse sort of thing that men do as boys. And then the next moment, look each other deep in the eyes and embrace each other and say, thank you. And like really feel like they're present with another man. So it's that kind of training is really, it's beautiful. And it gives men a sense of a resource of their brothers and that there's a greater web holding them. So once we've been in these kinds of a circle, like you said, around feeling the waterfall, the beauty of that, similarly, you feel the spines of these other men that sat there with you. And so one goes back into their life, back into the challenges of life, which will always be there. And you remember there's this thread back to this moment where you were having this really deep conversation with this other man, or the thread back to the whole circle and the power and the strength that was there. And so I think that's one of the things that men get, is that camaraderie.
I remember a friend telling me once he was really into martial arts and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And so he would be like wrestling a lot on the mats. And I was always impressed because he would say that he was so, this like warrior mode, right? Like I remember when he was having a really rough time, that's all he would do, just like for days on end, is just do like, wrestling on the mats and jiu-jitsu. But he would say there was also this like incredible intimacy. Like he could tell you if they'd eaten lunch or not, or what they had for dinner the night before, or if they had sex with their partner the day before or not. Like there was this cute sensitivity that was happening, even though they were like going at it, which I thought was so fascinating and very, very different from, I'm not like wrestling around on the floor with my girlfriends. So it's like a totally different sensitivity.
Yeah. But it's equally found on either side when someone is practiced and sensitive to their partners. And that's a way of looking at it, is that sparring partner actually, instead of being an enemy or someone, it's someone that brings out the best in you. And so that's one of the difference between men tend to grow through challenge, through, creating harder and harder circumstances to find freedom and find yourself through. And so I should say the masculine tends to grow that through that. And the feminine tends to grow through praise and celebration of one another and pleasure. So you praise one another. And it's like by speaking about how beautiful someone is, like that brings out their best. That doesn't always happen for the masculine. And yeah, you're talking about a really high level though, too. That capacity of sparring and really being super sensitive to see what your partner, like what are they living? What are they going through? And I would like to bridge that back to the intimacy between men and women and that demand to notice who's in front of you. And again, kind of back to some of the really basic yogic capacities of looking through and into someone, past their skin, past who you think you know, past their name, into their eyes, past the surface. If you're staring, it's like, this is more for men. Men tend to stare more and objectify in general, but we look through and sense the skin, and the breath is really big, synchronizing one's breath. And then you get into intimacy where you can synchronize and notice another person's breath. That brings you into a realm of communication where you start to really feel what is somebody living. And same thing with women in a women's group, or if you meet with your sister and you can feel like, what is her diet serving her? Or is she happy with her boyfriend? And did they get in a fight? And so I think in some level, being willing to see deeply into another person and then being able to be honest and loving in our reflection is invaluable. And sometimes that's praise. Sometimes that's like, hey, you've seen you doing this over and over again. What's going on there?
And to get to that level of being able to be so open to another human, we have to do that work for ourselves first, right? I mean, it just sounds so critical in order to have that level of vast openness. We first, like, we can't do that unless we've done that for ourselves, like every morning, right? It's like as a practice.
Yeah. If one can't sit with themselves without grabbing for a phone or fidgeting or doing something, even just fidgeting in the mind, like fidget, thinking about something that's not here. I mean, that's most of humanity. If we're really honest with ourselves, like most people can't, including, you and I, in moments where it's just, there's things, but that is important practice to choose time during the day to practice dropping into more of a sense of stillness and reverence and knowing oneself, so that when we turn towards another person, like you said, we have the availability, we have the space inside. So it's like, I'll let you in by being present. I'm not so full that I don't have any room for you.
Or that I need to like dump it on you and expect something back from you, or like you feed me with your energy, or fix my problem, or listen to me. Or it's like, if we've done that work for ourselves, then we can go into any conversation without being needy about anything. Unless, unless we're just like at the edge of edge. And sometimes we're in those situations too. But I think it's such a dynamic energy to be with another person who is looking after themselves to that capacity, because then when you come together, you can be present to what's right here, right now, right? It's like I feel it very much when I'm with you. Like, you and I can come to this conversation and we're just like feeling the electricity in the air. What's going to come out? What's going to come out next? Oh, he's changing directions. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, right. Versus like, oh, let me tell you about my week, Eli. It's like, no, it's like a totally different juice, right?
So, yeah. Alive.
Okay. So alive. Okay. I thought of one more thing I really want to ask you about. So, as I told you, most of the women that come looking for flower essences and that are in our community are women. However, there is one rogue blog post on our website. And when I say rogue, I mean, it's like we probably have 15 comments from men, and it's buried. It's something I wrote 6 years ago, maybe. And we still keep getting comments, and it's in our top 5, like SEO. People are finding this freaking blog post. I don't know how they're finding it, what search terms are using it, why we're popping up, and it's men. It's all men. Okay. The title of the blog post is Impossible Love and What to Do with It. And it's a writing of me offering several practices of what you do when you fall in love with someone who you can't have. They're married. They're in a relationship. You're a monk or a nun, or, whatever your situation is, you fall in love with someone, or they don't love you back. They're not attracted to you, whatever the case may be. It's like unrequited love. Isn't that fascinating?
That is. It's surprising me that would be the one post that would draw men out of the woodworks, out of the,
And I can understand it. I can even say from personal experience, I know how much that can bring you to your knees. And I'm just surprised that was the one thing that really is grabbing men's attention. Do you see that often in your work, or not as much?
A few notches down, that comes out, but usually not on the surface, and it's not the first conversation or consideration that we get into. But when we've, like I said, sort of gone through various layers to more of a vulnerable place that lives in everyone, yeah, certainly there's a lot of that, and there's I think just stories of of things that were lived that aren't fully lived through yet, or grief, sorrow, shame, different areas that people aren't able to access until they are. And that's a little different quality, but how I would speak about what you're describing, and this comes in too. How do I say this? It's similar to what we were speaking about in the beginning of when we feel the dependence on life. There's a different quality of real vulnerability. And same thing with love. When you feel that you will love someone and they will eventually disappear from view, that everything we love will eventually disappear. And that's a big breath to really inhale in and live with as we're here. And that creates depth when someone feels that quality and isn't crushed by it and doesn't just become a renunciate and say, okay, fine, I'm going to go and meditate and just not deal with life, which is what was one way of doing that was, okay, everything's suffering, so let me just renunciate all of it. That's a very kind of intense masculine thing. And very few people really, that's their karma. A lot of people do that to escape the challenges of life. But if we live in life close to that fact that we want to love fully and be in love and yet know that it's temporary, there's a different reverence. The way one touches someone's hand, you feel like this moment is precious. This conversation is precious. We'll never have this conversation again. And so that, I think, is important for all people to be close to stay close to that.
And are there any words of wisdom that you find yourself commonly giving others lately, or something that just particularly springs to your mind or heart in this moment?
I said it already, I think twice, but I'll say it one more time because I think it's so important these days. And I've used it as a sense of, with so much screen time, we're all on these screens in various ways, kind of, and I say often that the antidote to screen time is skin time. And literally the touch of air, the touch of one's own hands on the body, the touch of someone you trust, it brings us back out of the screen, back to here. And then what we are is then transmitted through the screen with more trueness, with more realness of our core and our essential being, rather than being lost in something. And so I think one of the greatest wisdoms of these times is, how do we stay here in our body and embodied and willing to breathe through and open through whatever life brings our way? Because that's practice. And life doesn't make it easy, and it doesn't get easier as we get older, as we know. So, how do we say thank you to life and thank life for the opportunity to be challenged by our husband or our wife, or to be challenged by a physicality, or be challenged by the craziness going on in the mainstream narrative? It's, rather than shutting down, let our response be one of just showing up more into our body and with the people we love. And that's what I do my best to practice, moment by moment by moment.
Thank you so much for being with us. If people want more of you or your work, or want to learn more about you, or if there's a man out there listening or a woman out there who wants to recommend their beloveds to find your work, what do you have coming up, and what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm actually planning on going to Denmark if they let me in, but strange enough.
I love it.
Yeah, it's the 8th annual European Men's Retreat I'm going to. So if there's anyone in Europe and wants to go to this, it's at the end of August. Other than that, I don't have any plans for future events. I'm waiting to see what unfolds. So the best way is right now actually is through Qigong. I found that has been a really beautiful way to transfer what I teach and what I learned through a screen rather than talking about it. It's more movement and images and mythopoetics. And I am offering that regularly. So the best way is to go to my website, eliburen.com, and there'll be some information about that. And that's good for both men and women too. In September, there's a couple new programs that are starting out that are taking a lot of what we spoke about and taking that into motion. And then
digitally as well, like through the screen, digitally too,
yeah,
or in person.
No, digitally. So actually, I know, and it carries well, and so it's always a sense of how much screen time do I want to have this body in front of? And I feel like the transmission of chi through some of these practices is superior to the screen time. So if there's a certain amount of chi coming through, which it does, then that in a way makes it worth it to be in front of a screen and to practice. And so ideally it is in person. And if someone's in Boulder, Colorado, I will be teaching in Boulder. And then I also do work with some Zoom client mentoring and sessions. So that's always an option.
Wow. Very cool. Okay. Well, I hope the world gets back to regularity soon. And I would love to talk to you in the future about the possibility of some sort of creation together.
A shared retreat and immersion.
Be so fun.
Yeah, I like the idea. Let's continue that conversation.
Hot springs. Somewhere with hot springs. Thank you so much for being with us, Eli. I'm sure that the listeners can feel it just as much as I can, the level of work that you put into practicing what you preach. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much for listening to the Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at LOTUSWEI.com.